You're watching Global Conflict Uncovered, where we expose the untold stories behind the headlines. Most people believe peace is created through negotiations, signed documents, and careful diplomacy. But what happens when a peace deal is announced before one side even agrees to speak? That's exactly what happened with Trump's so-called deal of the century, a bold promise to end the generations-long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. It was introduced not as a proposal, but as a solution, one that the world was told could finally bring calm to one of the most explosive regions on Earth. But there was one immediate problem. Hamas, the governing force in Gaza, rejected it before it even existed in their eyes. To them, it was not peace, it was erasure. The plan was officially named Peace to Prosperity. It promised billions in investment, infrastructure, jobs, and the recognition of a Palestinian state, under strict conditions. But to understand why it failed so quickly, you have to realize something crucial. No Palestinian Authority helped write it. Unlike past negotiations, there were no handshakes, no marathon talks, no midnight bargaining between rivals. Washington drafted it in isolation, then unveiled it to the world as if acceptance was inevitable. Palestinian leadership, including Hamas, was not simply excluded. They were strategically bypassed. Publicly, the Trump administration framed the plan as historic. They spoke of a future where Palestinians would finally have economic growth and independence. But what they called a roadmap, Hamas called an ultimatum. And their response was immediate: total rejection. They declared it dead on arrival, not because of a single detail, but because they believed the entire framework denied their identity, their power, and their history. For Hamas and many Palestinians, the plan didn't acknowledge their struggle. It attempted to rewrite it. But this wasn't simply Hamas versus the United States. This was the exposure of a deeper fracture, one that had existed long before Trump entered office, a fracture within Palestine itself. Two governments, one people, and no unified voice. On one side, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority ruling the West Bank through diplomacy and political strategy. On the other, Hamas, the militant movement controlling Gaza through resistance and absolute force. They weren't just rivals.
They were enemies, born from a civil conflict that split Palestinian society in 2007, when Hamas seized Gaza in armed combat. And here lies the core problem. Trump's peace plan demanded unity from a nation that had none. For the plan to work, Hamas and Fatah would have needed to appear together, negotiate together, and compromise together. But accepting the plan would mean acknowledging each other's authority, something neither side would ever do. Fatah could not be seen as surrendering Palestinian land. Hamas could not be seen as laying down its weapons. To either faction, agreement meant suicide. So the plan wasn't rejected by negotiation. It was rejected by design. Hamas didn't just refuse, they condemned. They accused the United States of trying to force capitulation through economic temptation. They claimed the plan would legitimize occupation and strip Palestinians of East Jerusalem, long considered their future capital. And more importantly, the plan demanded total demilitarization, a condition Hamas would never accept. Not because they seek war, but because their entire authority rests on armed resistance. Giving up weapons would mean giving up control. Yet while Palestinians rose in protest, a silent shift was happening elsewhere. Across the Middle East, Arab nations responded, but not as expected. Jordan and Egypt criticized the deal openly. Saudi Arabia and the UAE issued careful condemnations. But behind diplomatic curtains, something changed. The Palestinian cause, once untouchable, began to lose its position as the core of Arab politics. Concerns over Iran, trade, security, and U.S. alliances began to overshadow calls for Palestinian statehood. Some leaders saw opportunity in Trump's plan, not because they supported it, but because it opened a path to normalize relations with Israel without Palestinian approval. This marked the beginning of a geopolitical pivot, a pivot Hamas recognized instantly and feared.
Because if Arab nations moved forward without Palestine, Hamas would lose more than leverage. They would lose relevance. Hamas understood what many outside the region did not. Political isolation is more dangerous than military defeat.
If the Arab world began to accept a peace structure that excluded them, their role as the guardians of resistance would crumble. So, instead of silence, they escalated. Statements were followed by demonstrations, and demonstrations turned into confrontation. Protesters marched through Gaza, burning images of Trump and Netanyahu, chanting that no foreign power would decide their fate. It was not just political rejection. It was a warning shot to the world. There would be no peace without their consent. But as the streets erupted, diplomatic boardrooms across the Gulf remained calm. Leaders who once tied their legitimacy to Palestine now weighed alliances with global superpowers. The result wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Months later, the world witnessed something once considered impossible: the Abraham Accords, formal normalization agreements between Israel and Arab nations, such as the UAE and Bahrain. For the first time in decades, Arab states moved forward with diplomacy that did not include Palestinians at all. What critics once whispered became undeniable reality. The region was changing without them. To understand why the peace plan unraveled so quickly, you must recognize this paradox. It did not fail because of poor negotiation. It failed because it was built on an assumption that negotiations had already taken place. It presented an end to a conflict without addressing the core of it. It sought economic incentives where political recognition was demanded. It offered statehood without sovereignty, borders without control, and promises without participation. For many Palestinians, especially in Gaza, this wasn't peace. It was surrender, packaged as progress. Inside Gaza, Hamas doubled down. Leaders declared that any attempt to implement the plan would be met with resistance. They insisted that Jerusalem was non-negotiable. They stated that Palestinian land could not be exchanged for financial aid. They invoked decades of struggle, martyrs, and international law. And while their rhetoric was defiant, it wasn't just metaphorical. Intelligence agencies reported renewed tunnel activity, mobilization near the border, and increased rocket testing. In their view, diplomacy had failed. Only pressure remained. Meanwhile, international observers asked another question. Was the plan ever truly meant to succeed? Critics outside the region argued that Trump's peace blueprint was less about ending conflict and more about redrawing alliances. By aligning Israel with Gulf nations, it strategically isolated Iran and minimized the Palestinian question. To supporters, this was genius. To opponents, it was abandonment. The Trump administration defended the plan fiercely, claiming it was the most realistic offer ever presented. They argued that past agreements had failed because they pandered to illusions. This plan, they said, embraced reality. But to Palestinians, it wasn't reality. It was a declaration that their struggle was over, decided without them. It's easy to ask why Hamas refused peace, but to understand their rejection, you must see it through their eyes. Accepting the plan meant validating borders they didn't draw. It meant accepting Jerusalem as permanently divided. It meant acknowledging Israel without Israel acknowledging the right of return. And above all, it meant renouncing armed resistance, the very principle on which Hamas was founded. So, when the world asked why they rejected peace, Hamas responded simply, "This is not peace." This is a final verdict written without trial. Yet, while Hamas stood firm, something else became clear. The Palestinian cause, once the unifying symbol of Arab identity, was becoming politically expendable. Gulf nations pressed forward with diplomacy. Western media shifted attention elsewhere, and the map of power in the Middle East began to redraw itself. What began as a vision of peace ended as a silent admission, not of success, but of geopolitical fatigue. As global attention drifted, one question still lingered like smoke in the aftermath of a failed fire. Can a peace plan exist without mutual recognition? Can conflict end if one side refuses to speak? The legacy of Trump's deal isn't in what it achieved, but in what it revealed. It showed a Middle East no longer willing to wait for perfect solutions. It exposed deep fractures in Palestinian leadership. It demonstrated that even without war, political isolation can redraw the battlefield. That perhaps the most unsettling reality is this: the deal wasn't rejected through diplomacy. It collapsed under the weight of silence.
No signing, no negotiation, no compromise, just immediate dismissal from those it most affected. And while leaders spoke from podiums, the people on the ground, families in Gaza, civilians in the West Bank, residents of border towns in Israel, braced for the next inevitable cycle. The speeches ended, but nothing changed. The borders remained. The fear remained. The question remained. Was it peace, or was it the illusion of closure? In the end, Trump's peace plan did not end conflict. It exposed it. It revealed that peace cannot be declared. It must be agreed upon. And agreement requires recognition, dialogue, and sacrifice from both sides, none of which existed here. Hamas refused because they saw no place for their identity. Fatah refused because they saw no path to sovereignty. And the region, for the first time in decades, continued moving forward without waiting for Palestinian approval. The plan will be remembered not for what it changed, but for what it confirmed: that the Palestinian question is no longer the central pillar of Middle East diplomacy. For some, that marks the dawn of new realities. For others, it signals abandonment. Yet, history teaches one truth: unresolved conflicts do not fade. They wait. The so-called deal of the century remains a chapter not of peace, but of political divergence. A moment when maps were redrawn in silence, and a people found themselves outside the room where their future was decided. Supporters will argue it was the first bold attempt in generations. Critics will say it was never meant to succeed. But beyond headlines and speeches, one fact remains undeniable: no deal, however ambitious, can survive without the consent of those it seeks to govern. And that is why it failed before it even began. Today, the conflict continues, shifting forms, shifting stages, but never truly disappearing. Gaza remains under blockade. The West Bank remains fragmented. And the region, though evolving, still carries the unresolved weight of a question no blueprint has answered. What is peace without justice? What is statehood without recognition? What is negotiation without representation? This is why Hamas rejected
The deal, not because peace was unwanted, but because they believed it was never truly offered. You've been watching Global Conflict Uncovered, where we explore the power plays behind world events. If this story made you question what peace really means, consider joining us. The next conflict we expose may be even more unsettling, and it may challenge everything you thought you understood. Before you go, think about this. Can a peace deal exist if one side believes it was written to erase them?